Now that we have all our 4 pieces stitched out, 2 A's and 2 B's, we are now ready to sew these together. So what you want to do is pair up an A and a B and make sure you've got them going the right way, like this. You're going to put them right sides together, and we are going to sew them together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So on the pieces, let's just zoom in just a little bit. So when we stitch them out, there's 2 lines of stitching. This is the inner line right here is where the batting was stitched down, and the outer line is where your fabric was stitched down. So what we want to do is we want to sew these together so that this line of stitching doesn't show. This second line doesn't show anyway because it's not on the top of the bag. So we want to sew just inside this line right here. So what I will do is set my sewing machine up with center needle position, and then I will use the mark on the foot to line myself up directly with this line, and I'll move my needle position over a couple of little pokes so that I'm actually sewing on this side of the line. So pin those together, make sure they're lined up, and then off to the sewing machine. Now once you've sewn that seam, we want to press that seam open. But I don't want to press directly on the cork. So if you've used cork or leather in your bag, you should use a pressing sheet. So I've just got a pressing cloth here, and I am going to press using my pressing cloth. I don't want to put direct heat directly on that cork. There we go. There. And just press that seam open. There we go. You have now successfully created your bag front and your bag back. So now what we're going to do is, now is the time to cut the lining. So we're going to flip this over and lay it down. This is my lining right here. I want to lay my lining down right sides together. I'm going to pin this just to my lining. I'm going to pin that all the way around, and then I am going to use the bag front as a template, and I'm going to cut the lining to match the size of my bag front. I'm then going to do exactly the same thing with my B side or my bag back. I'm going to pin it right sides together with my lining, and then I'm going to cut that out as a template. So go ahead and do that and cut out your lining for your front and your back. Okay, once you get that done, you can unpin your lining and put your bag front and back off to the side for now. Now, if you are uncomfortable pinning and cutting, you can always use your bag front as a template and just draw around and cut that out with either the scissors or the rotary cutter, or you can just do what I did and just draw around your bag or cut around your bag. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to form the lining, the inside of the bag. So you want to lay your 2 pieces of lining right sides together, and what we're going to do is we are going to sew down both sides and across most of the bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now you want to leave yourself about a 6 inch space at the bottom of the bag that is not stitched, and you'll do a little back stitch here at these sides and around, and then back stitch at the top. So that's our next step. Back to the sewing machine. All right, once you get that seam done, and I've marked here where I've left my 6 inch opening so that you can see it because my thread's a really good match. Give that a little press, and then away go my marks. All right, and set that aside with your bag front and your bag back for now, because now we are going to go ahead and make the strap. Now, when it comes to the strap, this is where you have quite a few options. In the instructions, it tells you how to make a strap that is, you start with a 2 inch piece of fabric, you'll end up with about a 1/2 inch wide strap, and it's 40 inches long. Well, I have decided for mine to match the hardware that I purchased, because my hardware is actually about 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to start with a little bit wider strip, so I'm starting with a 2.5-inch strip. And I also want the strap to be longer, just in case I want to carry it as a crossbody. I'll need a longer strap, so I have decided that I will definitely add in the slider. So I did have a slider in the beginning, and I wasn't sure if I was going to use it or not. I am going to use my slider, and I'm going to start with 60 inches of fabric by 2.5. That will give me the option of adjusting the strap length on the bag. But of course you can do what you want. So I'm going to continue with the instructions on how to make a strap with a slider. And if you don't want to do this, or if you have purchased a store-bought strap, skip this part of the instruction and you can go on to the next part. So for those of you making a strap, I am going to start with a strip of fabric that is 2.5 inches wide by 60 inches long. So of course I had to join my strip of fabric, and I joined it on the diagonal like we do if we're making binding, and then press that seam open. When I am finished with this strap, it's going to be about 4 layers of fabric thick, so I don't at this point think that I need to add any kind of interfacing. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your strip of fabric and fold it in half and press it down the entire length of your strip. Now the next step, open that out, and you want to bring this side in and give that a press all the way down the strip. Then we're going to bring this side in and press that all the way down the strip. And then of course we're going to fold it one more time, so it's going to look like that when we're finished. So go ahead and get all that pressing done, and then now once I get that pressed, I'm just going to do that final fold, and I'm just going to use these clips. You can use pins, but these clips are just mighty handy for this sort of thing. Now when I get to the sewing machine, I'm going to sew, and these stitches are going to show. They're going to show on both sides. So I want to use the same thread in the top and in the bobbin. And I think this is where I will use that pretty variegated decorative thread that I had brought out in the beginning but didn't use in the stitch out because I didn't want to stripe. Now on each end, just before I clip, I want to just turn that under just a little bit so that I don't have a raw edge. And you can just flip it like that and then fold it in, and fold it together. And I want to do that on both ends because I don't really want a raw edge on my strip. So now what I'm going to do at the sewing machine is I am going to sew all the way around the strip. I want to sew nice and close to the edge with the top stitch and go all the way around the entire strip so that it is sewn on all 4 sides. So that's the next job. Now again, I will be using my decorative thread, and I need to put it in the top and the bottom because both sides of the strap will show. And I also will increase my stitch length to about a 3, just to make a slightly longer stitch. Again, strictly for decorative reasons. So off to the sewing machine. There, once you get that done, give your strap a press. And I do like that decorative variegated thread that I used as a top stitch. So there we go. We are ready to now move on to the next step. Okay, so now we need to put our swivels on the end of our strap. If you are not using a slider, you are just going to put the ring on each end of the strap, fold the strap under like that, and then just do either a little square stitch or just a couple of back stitches nice and close to the ring. If you are going to put a slider on, which is what I'm going to do, what you want to do first is take the slider and put your fabric in and over like that, and then we're going to take that and we are going to stitch right here so that we sew the slider in to the strap. Okay, so here's the end with the slider. I've just pinned that down so that it doesn't move on me. And I want to go to the other end and put on one of my D-rings, or sorry, not my D-ring, my swivels. So I have that on there. Then I'm going to slide that all the way down here, fairly close to my slider. And what I want to do, I want to make sure first of all that I haven't twisted my strap. And I am going to thread it through this way, like so that I have threaded like that. Pull it through. There we go, and you'll see that I have my little loop right here. And at this other end, I'm going to take the other swivel and attach it just like that. Same way that I attach the slider, I'm just going to stitch back and forth across here, nice and close to the D part of the swivel. There we go. Now I have an adjustable strap that will give me some options for wearing the bag, where I can shorten or lengthen the strap when I want to. Okay, so this next step is making the little tabs that are going to attach the D-rings to your bag, and then you will clip your strap into your D-ring. So this is the part that's going to be attached actually to the bag. So you have a couple of options here. If you have a little bit of cork left over, you could cut a 3/4 inch by about 6 inch piece of cork, and that's not going to fray. So you would just put that together. We'll do a little bit of stitching and that's done. Or if you have no cork left over, you can do a couple of little straps exactly the same way as we made the other strap. Start with a 2.5 inch piece, fold it in half, press it again here, and here, like so, fold it over, and then you would do the top stitching. Now this part and this part are going to be buried in the seam allowance of your bag, so we don't have to fold these over like we did on the strap. So you would just go ahead and stitch down the two sides. You don't have to worry about these little edges right here. So whichever one you want to go with, that would be what you will do now. So I decided that I would go with the cork. Okay, the next step now is to sew our bag front and our bag back together. So lay your two pieces, right sides together, on top of one another. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew on 3 sides. You want to make sure that your seam allowances are lined up in the center as well. And if there's any confusion as to which is top and which is bottom, when you're laying it down, the bottom of the bag is slightly wider. Because don't forget, we're going to box that bottom yet, and that will bring that in. So the slightly wider part of the bag is the bottom, the narrower part is the top. So you're going to sew down these 3 sides, and again, make sure that your seams are lined up on the bottom. This is getting exciting now, we're almost there. All right, now we're ready to box the bottom of this bag. So what we want to do is you want to line up those 2 seam allowances on the bottom. So I just push my hands in, and I'm just going to squash those 2 seam allowances until they line up on top of one another. Like so, and I just kind of go by feel to make sure that those seam allowances are lined up on top of one another. And then from this tip right here, let's just move in a little bit. From this tip right here, I want to take my ruler and I want to line the ruler up on that seam allowance to make sure that my boxed bottom is going to be straight, and I want to be 1 inch away from that tip, and I'm just going to mark that. Then what I'm going to do is throw a pin in there, because I will be sewing directly on top of that line that I just marked. And that would give me a nice little boxed bottom. So before I go to the sewing machine, I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. Get my hand in there, make sure that that seam allowance is on top of one another, and squish it down. And then I'm going to go by feel and then double check it just to make sure we're right on top of one another. All right. Line up my ruler. Make sure that I'm going straight down that seam and draw my line. Okay. Throw in a pin. Back to the sewing machine now, and sew directly on top of those two lines. So there we go. I have stitched across my bag. Now before I do the next step, which is going to be trimming off that excess, I do just want to pull it out and take a peek and just make sure that my seams are matching up quite nicely. Although really, to be honest, if they're off a little bit, anyone who mentions that or is that close to my bag, there's some issues. So now the next step is to just cut that off, leaving yourself a seam allowance of about 1/2 inch. And do that, of course, on both sides. Okay, now we are ready to take care of the lining. So the first step with the lining, we have already done sewing down the 3 sides, left an opening at the bottom. So the next thing we're going to do now is we're going to box the bottom corners of our lining exactly the same way we did it on the bag itself. So you want to go down into the corner, make sure that your seam allowances are on top of one another. And you can do that pretty much by feel, because this is a lot thinner than the bag itself. So here I'm just feeling to make sure that my seam allowances are on top of one another. And here they are. I can feel that. And then what I want to do, same thing, is I want to line the ruler up so that the ruler is centered on the corner of the bag. And I want to make sure I'm lined up right there. And then I'm just going to draw a line, throw a pin in there. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other corner, and then I'm going to sew right on top of that line right here. There we go. I have sewn on top of the line, boxing my 2 corners in. So now I am just going to take a pair of scissors and nip those off, giving myself, about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but close counts. I'm not overly fussy on the seam allowance for this one. It's going to be inside my bag. Now, the next step is to actually add a little bit of reinforcing to the top of your bag. This is where we're going to put a snap. So we wanted just to add a little bit of reinforcing in there. So I'm just going to give this a quick little press. And then what I want to do is measure how big this is, because it's going to change a little bit depending on what bag you're doing. And this bag here is 13.5 inches total outside to outside. So now I want to take a couple of pieces of fusible interfacing, and this is just a medium weight fusible interfacing, just to add a little bit of stability. And I'm going to cut that off at 13.5 inches, being very careful not to cut through my tape measure. I have a few tape measures that are no longer 60 inches long. They're quite a bit shorter than that. Now I'm going to fuse a piece of this stabilizer to each side of the top of my bag. So you might need a pressing cloth. This one's not too bad. Like that. And then I'm going to fuse a piece of stabilizer to, interfacing, fusible interfacing to that side of my bag. And just make sure that it's fused down well. I think we're okay here. Nope, not quite good enough on this side. Once that is fused, just take that off to the side for just a second. And what we want to do is actually set our D-ring loops into the bag before we put the lining on. So if you remember, I chose to make mine out of the cork, so I have no raw edges to worry about. But what I want to do is I want to cut these to be exactly the same size. There, I just zoomed in a wee bit. So I want to make sure they're both exactly the same size. Now the length of these is also a little bit arbitrary. You don't want them to be really super long. So I have chosen to cut mine at 2 1/4 inches from here where it wraps around the D to the end. So the original size of the strip would have been 4 1/2. So I originally cut them at 6. Now I have cut them down to 4 1/2, folded them in half, and I now have 2 1/4 inches from here where they wrap around to the end. And now I am going to just stick a pin in there so that they stay together. Now that I have them lined up, like so. They are now ready to actually sew into the bag before we deal with the lining. So I'm going to pull my bag front back out of retirement there for the moment. And I want to take on the side seam, this is the side seam, I want to line up one of those rings, and I'm going to make sure that I am centered over my side seam so that this is perfectly centered on the side seam of my bag. And I'm going to put a pin back in there, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing on this side seam. Let's just get rid of some of that fraying. There we go. And I'm lining it up with the top of my bag. Right like that. So I'm right at the top of my bag, and I'm centered on my side seam. Just like that. So make sure both your sides are exactly the same, where they're centered, lined up on the raw edges, centered. Now what I'm just going to do is just go and do a little stitch just to hold these in place so I can get rid of the pins. And I want to stitch about 1/4 inch. So when I put the bag actually all together, I won't have to pick those stitches out because they're not going to show. So next step, off to the sewing machine, sew across here about 1/4 inch, and you're just basting those in. And I'm back. I've got my 2 little D-rings basted onto the side of my bag. Now it is time to actually join the 2 layers. So what I'm going to do now is put the bag inside my lining with right sides together. So the right side of my lining is against the right side of the bag. And you're just going to do that. Put them inside one another. Now you want to make sure that you have lined up the side seams. So I'm just going to open up that side seam there. So I am, if you can see here, I'm lining up the side seam of my lining with the side seam of my bag. And here I'm going to use the little wonder clips. I find them super easy to hang on to and use as opposed to the pins. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I want to line up my side seams before I line up anything else. So I'm lining up my 2 side seams there and throwing in a clip. Now I'm going to go all the way around and just clip the 2 bits together. And they should fit pretty good. Okay, so once you get that clipped, your next step is to sew all the way around the top of the bag with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we're going to go back to the sewing machine, 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the top of the bag. Now for this section, you can use your free arm, but I actually find it easier to sew looking at the inside of my bag and just holding it like that. Of course, removing the clips as I go and sewing it this way. Give it a little spin when I get to the to the edge. Remove that clip. Give it a little spin. And when you get, of course, when you get to the side seams, they're a little bit thick. So you might just want to slow down. Needle down position is also excellent because it will hold the bag in place as you're maneuvering it and moving it around. And we're coming up on that second corner there, or second side seam. There we go. And there we go. All the way around. So I'm just going to do a little back stitch. All right, once you get that done, it is getting pretty exciting now. Now we are going to take the bag and we want to pull it through that hole that you left in the bottom of the lining. Now this is where it is a whole lot of fun if you didn't leave your bottom hole big enough. And just keep pulling that through. There we go. Okay. Poke your bottoms like so. All right, now just before we stuff that lining into the bag, this would be where you will add a snap in. So you will have the two pieces of your snap, and each piece of the snap has two little prongs. So those little prongs right there, that's what you need to accommodate in the bag. So what I do is I will just push it on a sort of a softer surface. So let me just zoom way in so maybe you can see those marks that I'm leaving. All right, a couple of things you want to consider. First of all, we want the snap to be lined up with the center of our bag. So this is my center front of my bag. So I want to make sure the snap is lined up there. I want the snap to be down so that it is still in the interfacing, but I don't want it to be too close to the top of my bag. I'm going to be doing some top stitching later, and I want to be able to get the stitching done with my foot. And if I put it too close to the top of my bag, I won't be able to get that stitching done. So I have decided that I am going to go down from the edge of my bag. I'm going to make my marks at 1 1/8 inch. That will give me enough room to actually sew. And if I'm a little bit shy, I can always use my zipper foot. So I'm going to measure down 1 1/8 inches. So I'm measuring from the seam right here. And I want to make sure that I am lined up right with the center of my bag. So I've put some markings there. Okay, so I'm lined up with the center of my bag. I'm down 1 1/8 inches. Then what I want to do is take the little prongs that are on my snap, and I'm on a semi-soft surface, and I'm going to push fairly hard, and I can see a couple of indents where the prongs have made indentations in the fabric. So I'm going to mark those in. Then what I'm going to do is reach inside the bag, and I want to use a seam ripper to cut a little slit, about the width of the snap, on both of those. And I'm going through the interfacing, and I'm going through my fabric. And then all I do is stick the snap through those holes, assuming I've made them big enough. Let's flip this to the inside so you can see. And I'm going to, now I got to make them a little bit bigger. Not quite big enough. I want to be super careful that I don't get too carried away and make too big of a hole. So I'm being very controlled as to how I use my seam ripper. And now let's see if I've made them big enough. Oh, that's better. I can feel the snap going through now. So then, now I've got that to the inside. So now this is the inside of my lining, right here. And you can see I've got those two little things poking through on the inside of my lining. Then I just take the kind of the washer, and I will push those over. Now sometimes it requires me to use a tool to push those over, like something hard, whether it be my scissors or you know, some kind of metal tool, because my thumbs just can't push that over. But I will just get that started, and then I can use another type of tool to push that over. Sometimes I just use the edge of my not good scissors. There we go. All right. So I've pushed that over for the snap, and now my snap is done. So I want to repeat the exact same thing on the other side of the bag. Now, once I get my two snap pieces in, I'm going to take the lining and stick it down inside the bag. Make sure it's a nice fit. Oh, and that is a lovely fit. So, this piece right across the bottom. Now, this is the hole that we left in the bottom. You have a couple of options here. You can just fold in your seam allowance, like so, and do a top stitch across here, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to throw a couple of pins in there. Then I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to top stitch this area between here and here. Now, if you want to, you can always hand stitch that closed, but this is the bottom of the inside of your bag. And then once you get that done, we're ready to move on and just about finish this bag. So I'm going to take my lining, I'm going to push it down into the corners, make sure it's nice and smooth in there. And then the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to do a little bit of top stitching now. So I want to make sure that the lining isn't showing up on the front. I'm going to just roll it over with my fingers so that there, like that. And throw the clips in. I just want to roll it down so that you can't see the lining from the front. Put in your clips. Now you want to make sure that these are sticking up. You don't want to sew them down like that. You want to make sure they're sticking up. All right, now we are going to go back to the sewing machine, and we are going to run a nice little top stitch all the way around the top of the bag. Now, I think that I am going to go back and use that decorative thread, the same one that I used on the handles, and I'm going to do my little top stitch all the way around. I want to be about between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. As long as you're consistent, it doesn't matter what measurement you use. You just do want to be careful of where you have those snaps. I want to have it so that I can move, sew my foot nice and flat in here, and the snap is down far enough that it should work. If it's not, if I got a little bit carried away or the snap's a little too close to the surface, I can put my zipper foot on and do the same thing where I sew a nice close top stitch all the way around the outside edge, the top edge here of the bag. Now to stitch this last seam, I do find it the best at this point to use my free arm. And I am just going to move my needle position all the way over to the edge. And I can use the edge of my presser foot as my guide as I go all the way around. And I do want to increase my stitch length to a 3, just for decorative purposes. And off we go. I want to make sure that that is pulled out. And then I don't sew with it flipped like this. I want it pulled out. And that's a nice thick seam. So your machine might go, eh. But nope, it's fine. Make sure that that lining is tucked in. Now I'm coming up nice and close to that snap that I put on. So hopefully I left enough space. And we're almost there. Get rid of that last clip. Tiny little back stitch. And we're done. Woohoo! And there we go. Once you get that top stitch done, the only thing left to do is to clip on your strap. And you are good to go. Congratulate yourself on a job well done. So there you have it. A beautiful bag done on your embroidery machine, working with cork. If you chose cork, you don't necessarily have to. And all done within just a few hours. So it didn't even take all that long. Thank you very much for watching. And if this is the first time you've seen one of my videos, please hit the subscribe button to be notified when I have more videos available. Thank you very much. This is Kelly Richardson from Kelly's Creative Comforts. Bye for now, and happy sewing.